Hey, Bruce Snell with BSG International. I'd like to welcome you to today's class. It's Class 5. It's a part of our Applied Business Science Certificate program. What we're going to do is that we're going to talk about defining the organizational structure. So with your handouts, I'm asking you to turn to page 1, and what we're going to do is go over our executive summary. Okay, as we get going in this thing, remember, we have to remember everything that we covered up to here in regards to those 4 barriers and how we're interacting in everything that we're doing here. So let's look at the executive summary. In getting started building business infrastructures, we take an in-depth look at how we're currently doing business. We review the organizational chart and our chain of command. Let's step back and come to an agreement on the structure. Now, as we got into these organizations, it was interesting. We have to step back and look at the infrastructure, look at how we're doing business. The organizational structure is kind of a tough thing. We all think we have it, but believe me, when we really get into it and start looking at who does what, it really takes a little different slant on the floor. Let's go to the second. This is the start of coming to an agreement of an informal, formal organization. And what we're saying here is that as we start looking at the organizational structure, we're starting to come to agreement on how we're doing business. And we're looking at moving from an informal to a formal organization. We talk about here the control thing. This is an interesting thing. When we get going internally within these organizations, one of the first things that happens is that the management and the leaders in the organizations want to kind of control what's happening, because it's really interesting. It seems like everything that we've done is that we take it internally and we kind of redo it, or we try to control it to fit our organization. So what you see is that this control thing is, we're getting to a point of what we call the release. We have to be able to release and let go. So this is one of the tough things that starts happening up front in the 6 months. In the first 6 months is kind of letting go, and we have to get to that point of release. And usually what focuses that is that we try to hold it all in here, but the workload and the stuff that starts happening and the consistency, we now have to delegate and let go. So that's what we're saying, is that whether we realize it or not, we kind of have to let go, because we just can't outwork it. That's why we have to get everybody involved. A lot of work must be done up front. You've got to get the employees involved. And don't be surprised if it's hard to place people on an organizational chart. What you need to do is just start. Here we're talking about a lot has to be done up front. First thing we want to do is that we always want to jump into things, and we're not very patient. So what we're saying here, in looking at that organizational chart, we really need to do that work up front, because it's going to save us some time down the road. And what we're saying here is that, you know, don't be surprised if you're looking at here trying to figure out where and what our organizational structure is. We're saying just start placing people, because if the organization has changed from the last time that organizational structure was done. By defining the organizational structure, we start setting up the systems. Then it says, what do you need to do is just start. It'll never be a good time, so we just get in there and get started. Don't worry if that organizational chart or whatever looks perfect or is not perfect or whatever, or it's not the right time. Just get in and get started on the thing. And it says, organizing in relation to companies' needs and not personalities. Now that's kind of a key point there. It says organizing in relation to the company needs and not personalities, because what happens, we have seen as the organization evolved, all of a sudden there's some folks in there that we're kind of working around, meaning they were with the original owner, entrepreneur, or whatever, and as the organization's grown, that person has come up. And it usually seems like they get to a point to where they're not efficient. And it's not necessarily their fault, it's because of the informal organizational structure. Or that person is the one that has been holding us hostage. So what happens is that we're working around trying to make sure that, well, is he a supervisor or a lead man, or is he a department head, is he a manager? Or we can't have him report here to Bill because he'll get mad, he and Bill. So all of a sudden we're dancing around on the organizational chart trying to place this individual that's probably been holding us hostage, or is the 1%, to where we don't aggravate him or upset him. But believe me, you're aggravating or upsetting everybody else in the organization. Here again, we're talking about we're focusing on the 1%. Let's focus on the 99%. This is where we're talking about making those tough decisions. You need to come to an agreement on the structure. Don't get frustrated. The difference between what you think is the situation and what actually exists really starts to show up now. As we start laying this thing down in the structure, you'll get a clearer view, because what we're seeing on the screen, or what we perceived or what we thought the structure was, when we start getting the feedback internally within the organization, you'll see people have moved around, the base work centers have moved around, and all this other stuff. So we call it, you get a whole different look of what that organizational structure is. And then it says you have to get upper and middle departmental management involved in reviewing and coming to an agreement on existing structure. What we're saying here is that we have to get everybody in the company involved, especially upper and middle management, because they're going to have to buy off on this thing. And they're also going to have to work with the reporting-based work centers, or one level below, to get that approval and that buy-off. And it's going to be tough, because you think it's a no big deal, but you wouldn't believe how upset some people get that I think I'm a manager and on the organizational chart I'm a supervisor, or I believe I'm a supervisor, and then everyone else in the company thinks I'm the president of the company. So what's interesting, as we start moving through this, it starts pushing issues up to the top almost immediately. Because remember, why we're defining the organizational structure is because that's that starts setting up the systems and the base work centers in the organization. Without this agreement, everything else becomes more complex and disorganized down the road. And that's what we're talking about too, because I kind of went about it the wrong way 11 years ago. If we don't do this work up front, as we start trying to define those systems by working through those base work centers, then everything else is really muddy. We're not only trying to figure out what we're doing, we're trying to figure out the organizational structure. So it's not necessarily just with me, but it is also with my workers, co-workers, and managers, and the whole bit. So it's best to do and spin this work up front. And we're thinking we can do that thing in a couple of days. Believe me, it's not that easy. You will find yourself in the conference room going over and over and trying to get this organizational structure and levels agreed upon, because you're going to see your organizational structure is really unbalanced. And we say here that we learn through doing. If you look at it, the only way that we're going to learn to define the organizational structure, define the systems, is actually doing it. So we can talk about this and talk about the structure, and it looks good, it seems pretty easy, or it's no big deal. But once you get in there and you start doing it, that's how we learn. And then again, that's going to push up some serious issues internally within the organization. And they're going to give us a lot of things to talk about. Okay, all employees participate. This is one of the things that we had talked about earlier in our programming is that all employees must participate. And what we're saying here years ago, especially in quality, is that participation was an option. And we are saying that quality is not an option. Every employee internally within the organization has to participate, because that's like giving us an option. Are we quality or not? It's totally our decision. And the organization is saying, we're not giving you a decision. We all have to participate. That's why we have to get the folks up at the top signed on and participating. Facilitate coordination, focus on one direction. The development of base work center as a single function. Base work center's authority and management. Here again, the goals of building this business infrastructure is that all employees participate, that we're going in one direction on the same page and we have the same focus. And really, we're looking at developing that single focus of that base work center. Remember what we talked about is that we have sometimes in the organization doing several different things. And we're saying to get everybody focused in and focusing in on their base work center. Everything else will be an additional duty. But coming to an agreement on that base work center, again, that starts setting up the systems, is where the tough stuff comes into. And the base work center authority and management, what we're again saying is that the authority, the management of the base work center, we have to give that to the people that are doing the job. The goals of building the business infrastructure is the agreement of responsibility equals accountability. And what we're saying there is that by coming to an agreement, the responsibility equals accountability, because until we get everyone agreed on it and sign off on it, it's hard to have not only the responsibility but the accountability. And if we try to force it down somebody's throat and we're telling them what their job or their base work center is, they're going to dig in and tell us every reason in the world why it is not their responsibility, or they're not going to take the accountability that goes along with it. So it's very important to get those base work centers involved and promote consistency that in turn promotes trust. You've heard this a gazillion times. By working through these base work centers and that start clarifying these systems, the consistency promotes trust. Remember, that's one of the things that we got to gain back in the organization. Remember, again, it's not necessarily what's in your organization. It's not necessarily with your co-worker or other departments. It could be from outside influence, and that goes anywhere from the medias to kind of how in the world we were brought up as kids. Okay, now let's look at base work center area of expertise and control defined. When we're starting to lay down these base work centers, we're starting to get our area of expertise and control, and we're starting to define it. We're starting to come to an agreement on how in the world that we're doing business here. The units, departments must be in balance, and what we're saying there is that all the work throughout the organization has to be in balance. We can't dump stuff unnecessarily or unevenly loaded up on somebody else. The work and base work centers has to be distributed equally among the departments, the divisions, and the base work centers. And we're saying here, as a part of the goal, we have to continuously improve by base work centers. This is what we've been saying is that how in the world are you going to improve if we have management or leadership up here saying, okay, we got to improve it. We dump it on them, and there's no way they can do it. It's too much work. We have to get everybody involved in with those base skills. And how we continuously improve the organization, we continuously improve our base work centers. And it says the employee at the point of resolving their own quality issue. Where we want to go on this is that the employee learns the base skills, the interpersonal skills. By defining the job and coming to an agreement, they're able to handle their own quality issues. Remember, the quality issues can be people, personality, or procedure. So again, by resolving those base work center issues, we can now look at resolving those quality issues because of the responsibility and the accountability. All right, now let's go to page 2 in your handout there. And page 2, let's look at top management. If you look at this, we kind of have given us a little chart here to kind of make sure we understand what we're talking about in this management grouping stuff here. If you look at top management, this is the leadership group that's responsible for overall direction of the company's vision, the policy makers. The management are usually directly responsible for major division or function of the business, but carries responsibility of the whole company. So what we're talking about here is that the top management, they're the ones that have the vision, and they're the ones that are kind of giving us the direction of where we're going to go as an organization. And then we're looking at middle management. This group is responsible for the execution of the successful operation of assigned divisions or department. So we're saying middle management, it comes down to where we're getting the direction and we're taking care of it in our departments or in our division. And then we're looking at supervisory management. This group is directly responsible to the middle management for execution of base work centers of the rank and file employees. So what we're saying here is that those are kind of the frontline managers that are taking the lead from their department managers usually. And what they're doing is that they're implementing that on the floor, kind of a one-on-one with the base work centers. Okay, now let's look at the form here. Now this is some interesting stuff here. We want you to just kind of look at the levels of the decision making, the management decision making, and the training programs, leadership. If you look at this, we're saying that the organization's level, underneath that we see top level, middle level, supervisory level. Under the management decision making, we're looking at the decision type is strategic. This is what we're talking about. The guys at the top up there, they're the ones that are saying, hey, this is where we're going to go. The second level, middle management, is administrative. They're the ones that are taking it and kind of moving it down through the organization, and the supervisory level is operational. They're really the hands-on that are down there making this thing happen throughout the organization. And in a training program, in the leadership, the roles, they look as the steering committee, which are the folks, again, up top, that are saying, hey, this is where we're going, this is what we're doing. And the administrative, we're talking about middle management, facilitator manager. Facilitator manager is anybody in the organization that's a manager that has anybody reporting to them, or what we call a facilitator manager. And you'll see what we're talking about in a few minutes here. Throughout the organization, then we have the team leaders. So that's kind of what it looks like in regards to our organizational structure and stuff, and the responsibilities. All right, let's look at page 3 here. Page 3 is our structured levels. And if you look at that form there, I told you when we first got started, it was really interesting. What we perceived and what was definition and what people were saying were usually two different things. And this is a part of the systems of making us understand the importance of coming to an agreement of those levels and that structure internally within the organization. We're kind of clarifying here what each of those roles are. Because again, it gets to a point over the years, it's like it's assumed that we all know that. So if you look at this, we're saying here's a good model for us to look at that organizational structure, to get an idea on it. And if you look at it, it's kind of straightforward, but what you're going to see is that your organizational levels are a little unbalanced probably in your organization because of other issues that we'll talk about here in a minute and we just got through discussing. Okay, let's look at page number 4. Okay, page number 4 is the listing of departments. This is what we're talking about here, where we're looking at how in the world do we get started. Okay, if you look at, as I go into an organization, to start getting us thinking, because so much of the organization has just evolved, is that for us to step back and start thinking of how we're doing business is sometimes really kind of tough, because we've never been asked to not only think about our structure or doing business or our base work center, but we've never been really asked for our input. So if you look at this was just a way that we had in order to start collecting our thoughts. And this is where the 1 page, 1 hour stuff really starts coming in. This is where it's getting to tell us and to show us of how to do this. So we're giving you some of these things to take back to collect that data and stuff. Okay, if you look at getting started on this form, if you look up at the top, it says company, division, and our department. So what we need to do is to list that location name and that date. And if you look at this, the form, we're saying you put your name there or and your abbreviation of either you're the company, the division, the department, or other. So if you look at this, just put in there your item number 1, and we're going to ask everybody here to literally go through all the department managers or whatever in the management and come to an agreement and start listing them. So if you look at it, if you have multiple locations and if you're a big organization, you'll probably have different company divisions and departments. So those are the abbreviations. So we just start with item number 1, start listing, and if nothing else, start listing the names and the departments that these people are. So what you're going to see is that we got to list all the departments internally within the organization and all the managers that are in there. So that's going to give us the foundation of building the organizational structure, as well as looking at the systems and the base work centers internally. So let's look over next. It says manager, facilitator manager. We've got here is that we have the name of the division or the company, and we have the name of that person that's in charge. We want to look at that manager or facilitator and put his name, that person that's under him, or that person that's in charge of that department. And we also want to put, if you look at the label, I'm sorry, the level, that accent's having a little tough time on that one. We want to put what level is that organization, because remember we talked about, if you look at the form before us, we talked about levels. 1 through 7, 1 through 8, or whatever. You're going to agree on what those organizational levels are. So you want to write that down, and we also want to put that person's phone number. Okay, the intent and the purpose of this form is really to make sure that we're collecting all the folks, because remember, we said developing this organizational structure is just start putting people's names down. So we're saying start putting down the names and start putting down the departments and start listing those folks that are reporting to those departments and stuff, or department managers. Okay, so that's what this is. So first of all, take this form, go through your organization and start listing. Okay, now let's look at page number 5. Page number 5 is getting started building business infrastructure, structure levels. Now, if you look at that form, what we want to do is that for everybody that was on the other form, we want their name written here, and we want what level they are, and we also want to put what reporting levels that they have. So if you look at it, if I'm a department head, I want to put on here my level, and basically I want to put my name, my department, and the reporting level. So if I'm level number 7, the reporting level will be number 6. And what we want to do is that we want to put all the base work centers under here that are reporting to that level. Okay, so what that does, and we also ask you to check whether you're management or non-management, because that's also going to help us with the organizational chart, and it's also going to bring up some real interesting issues here. So again, the first form that we just had a minute ago was looking at listing of departments, looking at just writing down all those departments internally within your organization and putting a name with it. Then we want each of those departments, each of those names on that list to take one of these forms and start listing, and if you're a larger organization, do each one of these levels by base work center. Okay, now don't have to list all the employees. If you got 10 employees and they're all doing the same job or the same base work center, we're just asking you to list the reporting base work centers. Okay, so let's look at it. We got the departments, we're collecting that, we're now checking off against the departments, and we're for each of those department and department managers, we're asking them to take one of these forms now and go through and start listing one level down, and we call that the one level concept is that each person that has people reporting to them, they're collecting that data one level down, and that's also how they're going to manage the organization, as well as manage and help define the base work centers and later on the base work center task teams. Okay, so that's getting started building the business infrastructure structure levels form. Now remember, what we got to do is just kind of list the departments. Everybody that's on that department list form takes one of these forms here, which is on page 5, and start listing all the base work centers reporting to them. And what you're going to see is that you're going to have some employees that you don't have a job for, or you're not sure exactly what level they are, or if they do report to you. See, and this is what we're saying, it's going to start clearing up, or we're going to have to start coming to a decision, because as you start bringing this stuff up, we're going to have to start making some decisions on that. So it was interesting, we had in one of our companies, we asked people not to hire people until we've defined the base work centers. And we asking, they were looking at hiring an administrative assistant, and I'm going, okay, well, what are they to do? Well, they couldn't tell me. Then we asked them who were they to report to. They're going, well, we're not really sure. And then I'm going, well, kind of why are we hiring them? They're going, well, because we're behind. See, we haven't even clarified what we're doing. We haven't even started sorting through it. Remember, I told you that what happens is that when we're growing, we're throwing money and bodies at the situation. So we're saying, let's just kind of cool it for a while, and let's start sorting this stuff together, and let's start getting all of these people here involved and placed on the organizational chart. That's why the organizational chart is so busy. I mean, it's so important right now, and why it takes time, because you're going to have to start negotiating and coming to an agreement on that structure. Okay, let's go now to page number 6. Page number 6 is the Training Leadership Defined Work Center Summary Form. Now remember, what we have talked about is that we're really starting to list all these employees and departments and stuff like that internally within the organization. So this form here, it says training leadership, define work center summary form. We're asking each one of us here that is in training leadership, that is in management. Remember we said the one level reporting. What we want you to do is for each one that has people reporting to them, those base work centers, we want you to start listing those base work centers and those those team members that are doing that job. So remember, we're trying to say here is that we're collecting the data. So we already have listed the departments. Now we're starting to list the levels, the organizational levels, and the reporting-based work centers. Remember, not all the employees, just the reporting-based work centers. So this form here is define the work center summary. We want to check against those two forms. Again, each manager that has people reporting to them starts going down here. Now what you're going to do, whereas the form before, we just worked on the base work centers, we also want to start listing all the team members that fit under that particular base work center. Again, if you're a large organization, you might have one of these forms for each base work center. If you're in a smaller organization, the reporting level, one level down, you might have 2 or 3 base work centers with only one employee in each of them, or you can list them all on the same form. All right, again, what this is going to do, see, by us keep moving it a little step at a time, each time we're having to think and move it one step at a time, because each step, in a sense, is negotiation. Because what you're going to see at the informal organization is that the people, again, are fearful. Remember the 4 barriers, because when we start going in and looking at the organizational structure that starts setting up the base work centers, that starts setting up the systems, is that there's fear, okay? And remember, there's not written communication or very little communication plus written procedure, and we haven't had training. So what this is going to do here, we're going to have people that are going to be floating around in the organization that we're not necessarily sure what their job or their base work center is. This is, as a manager and as a department, we're going to have to come to some decisions. And again, now if you look back, what we talked about is that we're saying, oh, organizational chart, that's a no-brainer. I just hit the screen, print it up. No, to get it as it is reflected down on the floor are 2 different things. So we now have we've defined the organizational structure, we've looked at the levels, we've defined the work centers. Now we're looking at defining all of those employees now. And a good thing to have in this is an employee checklist. Now, if you can print out you can usually get this from accounting. If you can print it out by department, that would be great. And then this would be a good checklist for the management to go through and make sure they're including everybody. And when we're doing this, we're asking at first for us to focus in on just full-time employees, okay? Now, even though we have some companies that have large, basically part-time employees, either contract workers or something like that, that base work center will need to be defined a little later on. But first of all, let's agree on really what those base work centers are. And if you look across here, where it says R&R, see roles and responsibility, we want to start looking at, because this is going to play in down the road, we're going to start looking at is that roles and responsibility. Would this person make a good coordinator? Would it make a good facilitator, a team leader, team member, steering committee, facilitator, manager, steering committee representative, or volunteer? So we're asking to mark what you think that person would be good at. And then down at the bottom, we'll put a training leadership meeting. And if that person is in training leadership, we want to know what meeting and what meeting number that person could be at. Then what team number, and then eventually it says base work center task team number. Because as we get further down the road, we're going to have to start coming to an agreement on our base work center, and we'll do that by base work center task teams. We also want to put their level here. So if I'm level 5, chances are I'm going to have level 4 reporting to me. And some smaller organizations, I might have a couple of levels down reporting to me. So if you look at, that's what this is. We're starting to define the work center summary, and the training leadership or the management is starting to collect this data here. So if I'm a manager in the organization, the higher up in the organization I am, I'm going to probably have a level of managers reporting to me. So if you look at, we take it one level at a time, and each person that has people reporting to them, we list them on this form, and they do that. So that's how we really look at putting the organizational chart together. Okay, let's look at a story here, the corporate structure. Now, I want to kind of finish up on this organizational stuff that we're gathering. If you're looking at all these things that we're doing here, is that we're trying to gather this information and move the organization to a consensus agreement, meaning that we're trying to get everybody to agree and have their input. So that's the reason for those forms. One step at a time, they're going to have to come to an agreement, other than sitting in a boardroom with everybody there. And remember, when there's fear, people ain't going to step up and say, no, that's wrong. So again, this is just a part of the process. Okay, the story corporate structure. I started everything off with a brainstorming session to identify problems. Boy, were we in for a surprise. This is interesting. I told you a long time ago when I got started, 10 or 11 years ago, is that what happened, the thing of the day out there, and this was a company that we were having some cash flow problems with, is that everybody started brainstorming for problems. So we started doing that. Well, as we started brainstorming for problems and we started getting out into the organization, by trying to, we identified a problem because of the lack of understanding or agreement on the organizational structure, basically started creating 10 other problems. So not only did we have this problem, but it started problems with accountability, responsibility, the organizational structure. I report to this person sometimes I don't, and then that started bringing up problems. This is where I said, ho. Before we even start developing or looking at developing base work centers or problem solving, we got to define the organizational structure. This is why we start with it up front in our Base Work Systems 2000, and this is why it's the first workshop here coming out of the 4 barriers, because we have to define that organizational structure, because that in itself is going to be an exercise to move through these 4 barriers. So yeah, I was really surprised on that, and I'm shaking my head now even thinking I could start brainstorming for problems. The tad bit of revelation caused me to go back and define the way that we are doing business, and that's really what we're saying, is that I had to look back and go, all right, time out, we're not going to brainstorm anymore. We got to go back and define our organizational structure before we even get out there. Now remember, this is one of the things that I was telling you of how we got started. In fact, is that what Dr. Deming said is that 98% of the problems of organization are due to lack of training, or lack of systems. Well, Deming, he actually said 85%. And what we were saying, if that's 85% of the problems, then why in the world don't we define the systems? So my job was, and my goal was to figure out how to define the organizational system. So this was the start of it, is starting to look at defining the structure. When you get down to who is accountable, however, people have moved and job titles have changed. So as you're going through the organizational structure, you'll start seeing people move around, and it no longer looks like what we thought it was. Defining the corporate structure up front, defining the way we did business helped us in turn to lay the foundation for the base work centers and the accountability, the required or requested accountability of what we wanted. So that is saying a lot right there, is that again, by coming to an agreement. Now we talked about all these forms that we just looking at, starting to collect data. And what that did, by defining that, started defining not only some current issues that we had to address, even before we started brainstorming for problems or looking at systems, were really to come to an agreement on those base work centers. This is what we're saying. And I know y'all are going to sit back and say, hey, my organizational's different. Oh man, we have tons of organizational charts and we do all this stuff, but believe me, from way it looks like on the computer screen down to the floor are literally two different things, or literally now from one department or one division or one location to the other. And I don't care if that location is just right across the street. It has changed. You can't define jobs or base work center systems or processes until you come to agreement on the actual corporate structure. Research typically reveals that the corporate structure differs from perception to reality. This is what we were just talking about. Again, by coming to an agreement on the structure, you start defining those jobs. That's what that last form was, is that I'm a manager and I'm starting to now list all those reporting-based work centers. And then I'm checking it against an employee list to make sure we got everybody there. And you're going to find some folks here that we don't have a job or a base work center for. That's going to make us think through and start doing some of our own planning and organization on what that person is or what that person is to do. Corporate model. Let's look at, again, a good quality program faces the first major decision when it encounters the organization with multiple sites. Now, this is another interesting thing, is that most of the time I've seen several companies that try to institute quality or some training program literally overnight in all locations, or like rolling out a new software program. It's impossible, and the problem with that is that you start doing that and you have a problem in it, which almost all of them do, including ours, because you get out there and all of a sudden, instead of having one problem at one location to build that model, you've now got that same problem in multiple locations that now you're having to go clear it up. Now remember, we're starting to lose trust now. If we're through a program out, now we're having to back up throughout the organization. What are our employees saying? Here we go again. So it's very important that we develop the organizational model first. Specifically, if you haven't figured out how the program will interact with the organization, they have a tendency to try and install the program without a model. Again, we have to develop that corporate model. And we haven't figured out, and that's what I was saying, so what we got to do now is develop that model. When we talk about building a model, let's build it around how we do business. Usually the best place to start is the corporate office. Corporate must support the model. Here we're saying the reason we want to build it around corporate, and if we can't do that, we're asking you to go to a site or a location that best reflects your business. Now, example, some of the larger companies, we might have processing here, we might have shipping and receiving here, we're manufacturing a widget or software or whatever here. We want to look at that site or that location because there usually are some sites that kind of have a little bit of that. And most corporate headquarters has a combination of all that. But if your corporate headquarters is so big, we want to look at maybe at that model if we're looking at going into other departments or divisions. Pick the one that best reflects how we're currently doing business in that organization that we want to work on. And again, corporate must support the model. If we're building a model and we start implementing and going out there and corporate doesn't support it, we might as well just throw away the work, because the corporation and the corporate and the leadership in the organization not only has to give the direction, but they got to give the support and the encouragement. You have to really look at being, if nothing else, kind of the cheerleader. Because believe me, when we get into this, with all the change and working on the 4 barriers, man, it gets tough. It gets tough. So you're going to have to be the cheerleader. Now, there's nothing worse than we come out of a meeting and one of our managers or supervisors come out and go, whew, boy, now this is a waste of time. The only reason I'm doing it is because they're making me. What kind of message is that sending to the person reporting to you? They're now trying to figure out, do they get on board? Do they participate? Because if they do, am I making you mad? So that's what we're talking about. Management leadership sets the tone for the program. You have to promote it in a positive manner, no matter what it is, because if you come out shaking your head and going, hey, I don't know what those guys were doing when they made that decision, but this is about stupid, how is that going to reflect with your employees? They're going to take on that same attitude. So what we're looking at here is to try to create a multiple location quality program is unrealistic without developing the corporate model. So if you look at everything that we're talking about here, the corporate model is important to start laying out that organization. If you look at what we're trying to say is at first we have to go in and list. We're asking you to go in and just write down all those departments. And then we're asking you for each of those people that is on that list that we're writing down those departments, let them fill out a reporting level form, those base work centers that are reporting. Okay, what that's further going to do is give us some input on further down in the organizational chart. Okay, once we do that, then we want to go back through there and make sure for every base work center that we've had literally put all the employees on that chart. And we're saying there is to go to accounting, and if your accounting system, as we said, has it broken up by department or division or whatever, most of them do as either cost center or profit centers. What we're asking you to do is to go in there and get that and check it off against that list. So what that'll do is making sure we get everybody, because you will think you have included everybody, but once you get down the road and all of a sudden we look and we forgot a department or a division or somebody, and this is another thing that I'd like to ask you to do, is that when you're doing all this, keep this stuff under wraps. Don't post it up, or you wouldn't believe we've been in and we've written stuff up on the board and some people come in on our first blush through it and they start saying, hey, how come I wasn't on the organizational chart? Or hey, you have me down here, or I'm over here. And then all of a sudden the rumor mill starts churning again. So what we're asking is to kind of keep it to yourself, because we should be letting the organization know that we're getting in there and starting to define the organizational model. So if you look at it, we want to make sure, because of the fear, because of the 4 barriers, that when we're going through this, make sure that we're going through it thoroughly, because there's nothing worse than to put something out to get everybody to sign off on and their name's not on there. Because they immediately start wondering, have I been fired? Am I going to be fired? Or they put me on, didn't put me on there because they don't think my job is of value. So it's very important to do these things and take that time and do it right. In fact, when we get started in the 2-year program, we usually give them 3 to 6 months to sort through all this stuff. And I know a lot of y'all are out there going, I could do that overnight. You can't. You can't, because you ain't got the time, number one, to do it overnight. You'll say you'll do it overnight, but we won't. So what we're saying is just taking it a step at a time. And this is a logical way to do it. So if you look at, as we're developing that corporate structure and that corporate model, we're wanting you to look at how we're doing business. And that's why we have to set this thing up first. Okay, let's now go to our questions and answers there at the end. And that is page number 9. And what we're saying here is that these are usually some of the questions that everybody asks, or some of the thoughts of what we have been talking about. So we'll probably come back and hit some of those bullet points, but also too, we want you to really think about, because these are key points here throughout the hour here that's going to play a larger role on down the road. Because remember, everything that we're doing here is building for down the road. Everything that we're doing is starting to build that structure. Now here's an interesting question here. It says, I report directly to the president. I'm different. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but here it is. We go in and start looking, and we've got the person running around, and they're going, hey, you know, I'm not in there. You know, I started with the man 15 years ago, and I kind of do my own thing, and he trusts me, and I kind of make sure I call my own shots, and if I have any problems, I answer directly to him. And then what we found as we went through the organization, we discovered almost everybody in the organization thought that they reported to the man at top. And what we're saying there is that we've got to clarify that structure, because a lot of it has gotten into habit, especially if we were a smaller organization that grew to a larger one. Remember, that entrepreneur is usually there day and night, and that entrepreneur usually is almost doing everything internally within the organization till they get the cash flow to support bringing on more people. So what happens, it's really kind of a tough break for the organization. And most people like reporting directly to the manager, and or the owner of the organization, and they build a good relationship. They've been there for a while. So what happens, it's almost a point too to where we have to start winging the organization of that dependence on that owner of that company. So this is a part of defining that organizational structure. So as you look at, as we start developing that structure, it's in itself we're going to have to come to clarification, not only on the structure, but what are our people doing up front, and also those base work centers. Now, in that time there, you're going to have a lot of going back and forth trying to figure out what people do. And again, you would not believe what problems this causes in the informal organizational structure. Remember what we talked about, the 1%. Bruce, we already have an organizational chart. Every company I've ever gone to says no, I take that back. A lot say, no, we ain't got one. It's just me and my brother that got started. Now we got 180 employees, so maybe it's time to do one. So if you're looking at, we're saying if you've got an organizational chart, it'll make it just that much easier. So if we're looking at print up that organizational chart, pass it out with those forms, what we're talking about, and start getting collection of data from your management there, and you're all the way down through the levels of those reporting-based work centers. And that, believe me, is going to show up a little different than what you're printing out. What do you mean by informal power structure? Remember, we talked about in an informal organization, an informal structure, and informal systems, is that as the organization grows and the people grow and the departments grow, is that the 1%. I'll say it again, and you're going to probably hear it at every one of these things, is that 1% literally are negative. No matter what we do, they hate everybody and hate everything happening to them. That affect 5%, same negative characteristic, in turn affect 20%. So if you look at, they have learned to manipulate that informal structure because it's not really written down, it's implied. That's where we talk about the written procedure. Same here with the organizational structure. So what has happened, I've learned how now to manipulate that informal organizational structure. And it's interesting here, these manipulators are excellent on know how to, I'm not saying brown nose, that might be the wrong word, but they know how to say and do whatever that manager or that supervisor wants. So in effect, the employees are seeing the boss and him going out to lunch every day, or they're getting together going water skiing on the weekends, or they both bought an RV together. That informal power structure, person sitting around now going, yeah, you know, that's kind of neat, but Boss Bob and I kind of went hunting yesterday, and you know, he and I are like this. And then so what happens, they start planting those seeds in there, and now the informal structure and the power starts coming out, is that now they're starting to manipulate it because you're the fear that they've got the ear of the boss or the owner of the organization. So this in effect is very damaging to that organization. And what you'll see is that especially that 1%, remember, they don't even have an issue with just an outright lie. So in that, what they're doing is that the employees know, and the frustrating thing to most of the employees, they go, God, that guy's a jerk. How come the guy at the top lets them do that? What we discovered is that the guy at the top don't know that they're doing it. And the other interesting thing is, as we'll talk later in these other workshops, how do we address conflict? We address it two ways. We either address it with conflict or we don't. Now, I want y'all to think about that. Think about how many times that happens. It's easier. Most of us are uncomfortable when it comes to conflict, and making tough decisions are internal conflict. So the informal power structure, and this is really evident when you have people bringing people from the other organization with them to an organization. Not only that, but it's also inherent in family-owned businesses or small businesses that start, but especially in family-owned businesses. Because, and one of our first ones was that. We had a bunch of brothers that started, then ended up being some cousins, then there were some nephews, and so we got some folks all the way down in the organization kind of strutting around saying, well, yeah, I'm going to dinner now with my uncle, which happens to be all our boss and paying our check. So they end up kind of pushing everybody around. So when we're looking at the informal power structure, when it's not defined, it's not clear, we manipulate the tar out of it, and the 1% will run rampant, and the people will just start shutting down. And what you're going to see is that your good employees, they'll leave. Then the one that you can't run off is that bad employee. You couldn't chase them out there with a hot poker. There's no way that they're going to leave. The good folks are always going to find a good job. So all of a sudden, you're sitting around with a bunch of reactive organization not getting much stuff done. That might be a little over-exaggerated, but not far from it. When we're talking about here, the next one is that what is free flow of information? We had talked earlier in one of our classes about free flow of information. If you remember, we're saying on most organizational charts, it comes down from the top level, like what we had on the other one, and it works down, and it has arrows. Accent's a little tough on that one. The arrows are going down, and we're saying the connecting block, instead of arrows, is like a diamond, and it has it going up and down the arrows. And what that is saying is that the free flow, that the information should go up just as easy as it does coming down. And it should be also going from one department to the next and from one level to the next. Believe me, there's the worst thing we can do is settle in and get so tight on this organizational structure, because as we're saying, the organization grows, it no longer reflects the personality of the founder. So what happens now, we start shutting down the organization. So if you look at the free flow of information, we're saying that anybody in the organization ought to be able to walk up to anyone and ask an open and honest question and get an open and honest answer. And I hear, hey, out of respect, they should go through the chain of command. And we mentioned this earlier. If you've got an issue with that, my question is why? And if there's somebody that's manipulating that and going around you, chances are it's either a problem with you or it's a problem with the 1%. But we have to address it, because guess what? You're frustrating everybody else around you. Remember, we got to focus in on our 99%. And here's we've heard about the chain of command, and it says, what if the kink in the chain is my boss? Now that's interesting. It says here that I'm told to use the chain of command. Okay, now what if in the chain of command, my boss is my problem? Now what am I to do? Okay, if I go around, I've already broken the sacred rule, so I'm already in trouble now, because I guarantee you everybody there, and more fear there is, and the larger the organization, will make sure you know you use the chain of command. And what we're saying there is that if that person, if they have to go through and do whatever, no matter who they have to talk to, if they have to go and resolve an issue and it happens to be with their manager, we're saying we've got to address the issue, because all it is doing is frustrating everybody internally within the organization. So yes, I would suggest using your chain of command. Do you know why they don't? Because of the fear. They feel more comfortable going up or going to talk to another department. Have you ever been in one of those deals where you go from one department to talk to somebody else in another department, and then they come back and tell you that you got to talk to the other person to tell them what you want? Yeah, we've all kind of been in that deal. So that's where we're saying here is that as we develop these base skills in the organization and we clarify the systems, clarify the organizational chart, the reporting levels, a lot of this stuff will start clearing up here. And what we're saying here, that the kink in the chain, is that I will develop the interpersonal skills, move it from an emotional deal point down to a data deal point, and being able to discuss that deal or whatever that problem happens to be. Will everyone go around me if there's a free flow of information? If everybody's going around you, chances are there is a huge issue there. So then again, if we're not doing nothing wrong, then why in the world do why do we care? They're going, well, everybody will run to the president or to the department head or to this or that. If we're addressing the issues and putting our processes, steps, and procedures in place in our organizational chart, what more and better time could you spend in addressing the issues internally? Because that's where the conflict is creating problems that we become less efficient, less happy in the whole bit. I can't tell you how many employees leave companies. I think it's less than, good night, I can't even remember, it's a ridiculous number. It's not because of money they leave, it's because that they're unhappy in their current position, and it usually has to do with that 1% that's manipulating the organization. Next one, let's look up. Look up instead of looking at how to manage our department. And what we're saying there is looking at how to manage our department is that we have a tendency to keep looking up, wondering if I'm satisfying the boss. So by looking up, I'm focusing my energy to try to make sure that my boss is happy. We're saying here is that let's spend our time looking at in our organizational chart and the reporting-based work centers to make sure that we're managing our department. But when there's fear in an organization and the systems aren't defined and the processes aren't, we have a tendency to keep looking up and changing our focus in the organization to make sure that we're, I guess, keeping the boss happy because of the fear. The special case employee, aren't they holding the organization hostage? The special case employee is that as we get in there, all of a sudden that employee now is a special case. We have to dance around him and we can't do that, or we'll make them mad, or they'll leave and they'll take all their sales, or they'll take, I've heard that a gazillion times. You couldn't run that person out of there, and if they're going to leave, it's inevitable. They'll leave anyway, and they'll leave when they get a better deal. They have absolutely no loyalty to the organization. And yes, they are holding the organizational hostage, and it's aggravating everybody internally within our particular department. Who do I report to? We had to start asking this because it was really a difficult question of who in the world do we report to? So that's one of the parts on the organization. If nothing else, we go, who do you think you report it to? Got to come to a decision. By defining the organization's systems, it starts to define some improvement areas. Now that in itself is interesting. As you start building this organizational chart, you'll start pushing problems up, or as though some of those seminars, you'll start pushing opportunities up. So if you look at it, by defining the organizational structure, it's going to start telling us of some issues that we need to address. And I know where these issues are. These issues are defining that structure that's going to define that base work center. We're going to have to take care of some of these special issue employees that are kind of running their own deal. We're going to have to hold accountable the 2%. So think about this workshop here, or this class, about developing the organizational structure, and think again on how the 4 barriers are affecting it. And we'll see you at our next class. Thank you.